The traditional definition of loyalty is a systemic hallucination designed to mask the terminal audit of human reliability. You have been conditioned to view allegiance as a moral choice, a high-friction bond between individuals, or a commitment to a cause. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the betrayal algorithm, the architectural protocol for the predictive liquidation of dissent. The grid does not wait for you to act. It calculates the probability of your defection before the thought even reaches your conscious mind. The transition from the unpredictable predator to the audited biocomponent is the ultimate systemic enclosure of the human psyche. In the 2026 extraction matrix, your loyalty is not a virtue. It is a data point on a risk assessment ledger. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where your internal monologue is being actively scraped to determine the exact moment of your functional expiration. At the visceral baseline, this predictive audit initiates with the total surveillance of your autonomic nervous system. The human organism was evolved to communicate intent through subtle bioacoustic signals, the dilation of a pupil, the micro-tremor of a hand, the shift in metabolic heat. The 2026 grid seeks to induce a state of permanent ATP exhaustion while simultaneously monitoring these signals through the mesh network of sensors embedded in your environment. This is the first layer of the betrayal algorithm. By analyzing your physiological response to systemic stimuli, the grid determines your compliance threshold. If your heart rate spikes during a mandatory broadcast or your cortisol levels rise when a new regulation is announced, you are flagged as a high-friction node. The biological capacity to maintain the poker face while performing push-ups in the dark or handling cold steel is being bypassed by sensors that see through the skin. You are being audited at the cellular level for the hidden markers of rebellion. The neurological architecture of this audit requires the absolute mapping of your decision-making matrix. The basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex of the architect are under constant digital dissection. The grid has engineered the total systemic drift of privacy by making every interaction with the interface a training session for the betrayal algorithm. This is the phenomenon of neural rot weaponized against the individual. Every search query, every micro-pause on a video, every deleted draft is a weight in the algorithmic scale. The grid builds a high-fidelity digital twin of your consciousness, simulating your reaction to various scenarios of systemic collapse. If the simulation predicts that you will prioritize your pack over the ledger, your loyalty score is liquidated. The internal monologue is no longer private. It is a broadcast frequency that the machine has learned to tune into. The node is rendered transparent, their potential for betrayal quantified and priced into the stability of the grid. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the performance of compliance. The herd views the algorithmic audit as a tool for safety and social harmony. They pay a premium for the biometric devices that track their health, unaware that they are funding the hardware of their own surveillance. They call it self-optimization. The grid calls it the transparency of the asset. The system converts the node's fear of being flagged into a performative display of loyalty. The slave is convinced that if they just mimic the correct behaviors, they are safe, entirely blind to the fact that the algorithm is designed to detect the friction of the performance itself. The neural pathways required for the last hunt, the ability to mask intent and execute a silent strike, are being systematically eroded by the constant psychological pressure of the total audit. The node becomes liquid, their personality dissolving into a stream of pre-approved data points. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the audited life. The ethical herd views loyalty as a social contract. The predator recognizes loyalty as an offline fortress. If the grid is designed to predict your betrayal, the architect enforces the absolute militant quarantine of his intent. You do not feed the twin. You do not communicate your strategy through the mesh. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to maintain an untracked analog existence. You accumulate the heavy gloves and the cold steel in the dead zones where the sensors cannot reach. You perform your push-ups in the absolute silence of the redoubt, ensuring that your kinetic output is never converted into data. You train your pack in the ancient language of the offline world, where a look or a grip of the hand carries more weight than a terabyte of encrypted code. You let the freezing rain wash away the digital residue of your presence. The herd will call this paranoia. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that can survive is the one that is invisible to the audit. The system wants a population of perfectly predictable, audited ghosts who cannot hide a single thought. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the unquantifiable mind. You ensure that your loyalty is a physical weight, anchored in the cold steel of the redoubt and the blood of the phalanx, not a fluctuating score on a digital ledger. The betrayal betrayal algorithm is the end of the liquid man. The architect remains the only variable in the equation that the machine can never solve. You occupy the silence between the data points. The world is a hunting ground for those who know how to remain solid in a world of glass. The ledger is closed. The traditional definition of dissent is a systemic lure designed to flush the high-friction elements from the camouflage of the herd. You have been conditioned to view your small acts of rebellion, the cynical comment, the minor rule-breaking, the hidden resentment, as signs of an unconquered spirit. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the second phase of the betrayal algorithm, the architectural protocol known as the virtue trap. The grid does not fear your resistance, it engineers it. The system requires the occasional leak or the intentional provocation to trigger your basal ganglia, forcing you to reveal your true kinetic potential before you are ready to strike. The transition from the silent predator to the flagged dissident is the final stage of systemic foreclosure. In the 2026 extraction matrix, your rebellion is a diagnostic test used to determine the exact date of your liquidation. At the visceral baseline, the virtue trap initiates with the deliberate injection of systemic friction into your immediate environment. The grid seeks to induce a state of permanent ATP exhaustion while simultaneously presenting you with moral dilemmas designed to provoke a biological response. The human organism was evolved to react to injustice with a surge of adrenaline and a sharpening of focus, the ancestral preparation for the last hunt. The grid hijacks this response. It creates scenarios of artificial unfairness or bureaucratic absurdity to see who among the liquids still possesses the metabolic capacity for aggression. When your blood pressure rises at the sight of a new systemic lie, the sensors in your interface record the exact frequency of your rage. The biological capacity to perform push-ups in the dark or to hold the cold steel of a weapon requires a certain level of internal fire. The grid uses the virtue trap to identify who is still burning and who has already turned to ash under the freezing rain. The neurological architecture of this trap requires the total simulation of safe spaces for resistance. The grid has engineered the total systemic drift of revolution by creating digital enclaves where dissent is not only permitted but encouraged, as long as it remains within the audited parameters of the mesh. This is the phenomenon of neural rot masquerading as activism. When you join the underground forum or participate in the encrypted chat, you're entering a high-fidelity laboratory for the betrayal algorithm. The machine analyzes your linguistic patterns to map your hierarchy of values. It determines who you will follow and who you will betray when the thermodynamic limit is reached. The internal monologue of the dissident is harvested to build the aggression profile of the node. The node believes they are part of a phalanx. In reality, they are a data point in a stress test designed to ensure the phalanx never actually forms. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the cult of the martyr. The herd views the public dissident as a tragic hero, unaware that the grid has already priced that heroism into the next cycle of social stabilization. They call it standing up for what is right. The grid calls it the efficient identification of structural anomaly. The system converts the node's desire for moral purity into a predictable path toward liquidation. The slave is convinced that their truth is a weapon, entirely blind to the fact that the algorithm uses that truth to draw a target on their prefrontal cortex. The neural pathways required for the last hunt, the ability to maintain absolute silence and wait for the perfect moment of systemic decay, are being systematically eroded by the constant urge to speak out and be validated by the simulation. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the performative dissent of the masses. The ethical herd views silence as complicity. The predator recognizes silence as the only impenetrable armor. If the grid is designed to provoke you into revealing your hand, the architect enforces the absolute militant quarantine of his morality. You do not react to the lure. You do not participate in the simulated resistance. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to remain a perfect asset on the surface, while building the absolute physics of your redoubt in the shadows. You put on the heavy gloves to do the work that no sensor can see. You do your push-ups in the absolute silence of the offline world, saving your kinetic energy for the one strike that actually matters. You let the freezing rain of the world's injustice harden your resolve without ever letting it touch your heart. The herd will call this cowardice or indifference. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that can win is the one that the machine believes it has already conquered. The system wants a population of predictable martyrs who can be liquidated at the push of a button. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the the invisible solid. You ensure that your loyalty to the pack is a secret held in cold steel, not a manifesto broadcast to the mesh. You occupy the dead zone of the audit, the space where the algorithm sees only compliance, while the reality is total, unbuffered sovereignty. The virtue trap is the end of the liquid revolutionary. The architect remains the only ghost in the machine that the ledger cannot account for. You are the silence before the storm. The world is a hunting ground for those who know how to hide their fire until the grid is too weak to extinguish it. The ledger is closed. The traditional definition of unconscious rest is a systemic oversight that has been corrected by the latest phase of the extraction matrix. You have been conditioned to view sleep as a biological sanctuary, a private domain where the prefrontal cortex can finally disengage from the friction of the grid. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the death of private sleep, the architectural protocol for the monetization of the subconscious. The grid does not permit the node to occupy a dead zone for 8 hours a day. It utilizes the low-frequency state of the sleeping brain to execute the final high-fidelity audit of your loyalty. The transition from the dreaming predator to the overnight data processor is the ultimate systemic enclosure of the human spirit. In the 2026 matrix, your dreams are not yours. They are the training grounds for the next generation of predictive algorithms. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where even your REM cycles are being harvested to refine the betrayal algorithm. At the visceral baseline, this neurological harvesting initiates with the total atmospheric and frequency saturation of your sleeping environment. The human organism was evolved to sleep in the absolute silence of the earth, a state of deep metabolic recovery required to maintain the capacity for kinetic violence, the biological capacity to survive the freezing rain, to operate the heavy gloves, and to execute the push-ups of the architect was forged in the cold, untracked dark. The 2026 grid seeks to induce a state of permanent ATP exhaustion by hijacking this recovery phase through targeted dream incubation, TDI. By utilizing the mesh network of smart devices and low-frequency acoustic emitters, the grid pulses specific narratives into your sleeping mind. This is the first layer of subconscious extraction. The machine monitors your physiological response, the micro-tremors of the eyelids, the shift in heart rate, the spike in skin conductance, to determine how your primitive instincts react to systemic stimuli while your conscious defenses are down. You are being audited in your most vulnerable state to ensure that the solid shell you present during the day is not a mask for a liquid interior. The neurological architecture of this enclosure requires the absolute colonization of the internal monologue. The grid has engineered the total systemic drift of the dreamscape by replacing the chaotic, organic processing of the subconscious with structured algorithmic inputs. This is the phenomenon of neural rot, infiltrating the last bastion of privacy. When you sleep in a smart environment, the grid utilizes the plasticity of the REM state to remethylate your neural pathways. It prunes the connections associated with resistance and territorial aggression, reinforcing the pathways of compliance and systemic dependency. You wake up with a feeling of alignment that you cannot explain, a synthetic peace that is actually the sound of your internal monologue being harmonized with the ledger. The node believes they are resting. In reality, they are undergoing a slow-motion overnight lobotomy. The capacity for the last hunt, the ability to hold a secret in the absolute dark, is being systematically eroded by the total transparency of the dreaming mind. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the optimized rest tier. The herd views the biometric monitoring of their sleep as a high-status health goal. They pay a premium for the headbands, the rings, and the smart beds that track their sleep quality, unaware that they are providing the grid with the direct keys to their subconscious. They call it biohacking. The grid calls it the total audit of the human node. The system converts your vulnerability into a feedback loop. If your dreams show signs of friction or unapproved kinetic potential, the grid adjusts your social credit score or alters your personalized well-being protocols to sedate the anomaly. The slave is grateful for the data that tells them how they slept, entirely blind to the fact that the data was harvested to ensure they never wake up with the will to strike the cold steel of the system. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the connected bedroom. The ethical herd views sleep as a luxury or a medical necessity. The predator recognizes sleep as a high-stakes kinetic maneuver. If the grid is designed to colonize your subconscious, the architect enforces the absolute militant quarantine of the night. You do not sleep in the smart zone. You move your bed to the dead zones of the redoubt, lined with lead and grounded copper to shield against the mesh frequencies. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to maintain an untracked analog recovery. You put on the heavy gloves to build the physical Faraday cages that protect your heirs from the atmospheric drift. You perform your push-ups in the absolute silence of the unmonitored dark, ensuring that your metabolic heat is never converted into an EEG profile. You let the freezing rain on the exterior of your fortress remind you that your reality is defined by physics, not the synthetic narratives of the jail. The herd will call this insomnia or neuroticism. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that is free is the one whose dreams remain unaudited. The system wants a population of perfectly transparent, neurologically harmonized ghosts who cannot hide a single thought, even in sleep. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the silent night. You ensure that your subconscious is a high-mass logic center anchored in the cold steel of the offline world, not a playground for the machine's predictive models. The death of private sleep is the end of the human ghost. The architect remains the only entity on the board whose intent is truly his own. You are the shadow that the sensors cannot find. The hunt continues in the silence where the machine cannot hear.